Hey guys, tonight we journey into the freezing, mud-caked alleys of a medieval village where icy winds whistle through wooden slats, and survival isn't a luxury. It's the whole point. You wrap your cloak tighter, the cold already nipping your fingertips as smoke curls out from low, thatched roofs like sleepy sighs. Somewhere nearby, a pig squeals indignantly, probably being ushered into someone's kitchen, and not for dinner. You see, that pig's a space heater. You're about to discover just how terrifyingly clever, and sometimes downright weird, medieval peasants had to be to survive winter without modern insulation, electric heating, or even proper socks. And spoiler alert, if we dropped you into a 14th century January right now, you probably wouldn't make it to sunrise. These folks didn't just get cold, they outwitted it, or died trying. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Also, drop a comment with your location and what time you're listening. I love seeing where in the world you're tuning in from. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You open the creaking gate and step into a village where snow crunches under your worn leather boots. It's not picturesque. This isn't a Renaissance painting. The mud's half frozen, chickens cluck resentfully in makeshift pens, and even the dogs look like they've seen things. You pass a hunched figure pushing a cart full of firewood, each log a piece of tomorrow's survival. Winter didn't sneak up on peasants. They prepared all year. Every chore in spring, summer, and fall had winter's breath breathing down its neck. If you didn't store enough food, repair your roof, or reinforce your walls, winter wasn't a setback. It was a death sentence. The medieval calendar revolved around it. Harvest festivals weren't for Instagram. They were for stockpiling calories like your life depended on it. Because it did. You duck into a peasant's home, a one-room hut that smells like smoke, wet wool, and something that was once a cabbage. The walls are made of wattle and daub, a charming phrase that basically means woven sticks covered in mud and animal dung. Insulating? Not exactly, but you know what? It works better than you'd think, especially when the cracks are patched with straw and rags and whatever else you can shove in there. Historians still argue whether medieval peasants truly suffered all winter or whether they adapted so thoroughly it just became normal. The truth is likely both. There's something called the Little Ice Age that hit between roughly the 14th and 19th centuries. Winters got colder, snowier, more brutal. And these villagers? They endured it year after year with no central heat. No synthetic fabrics, no fleece-lined slippers. Just ingenuity, stubbornness, and a tolerance for discomfort modern folks like you might call heroic or insane. But you're still cold. So you sit on the bench next to the hearth, rubbing your hands together, feeling the fire's warmth crawl up your sleeves. There's a pot of stew hanging above the flames, bubbling slowly. It's been cooking all day. You sniff it. Turnip, maybe onion. If you're lucky, a bone. Calories are heat and fat is gold. The more you eat, the warmer you stay. More on that later. One of the strangest things is how peasants used darkness and idleness as survival tools. There's this idea, possibly exaggerated, that medieval villagers slept in two shifts, first sleep and second sleep. Between them, they'd wake, pray, talk, maybe snack. But the real point? Staying in bed longer meant using less energy, burning fewer calories, and not risking exposure to cold. Every movement was weighed like a precious coin. And this village isn't silent, far from it. You hear kids shouting somewhere, the creak of a well being drawn, the bark of a dog. Life goes on, even in the cold. But it's all dialed back. Fewer errands, less travel. You stay close to home. Winter wasn't a season for productivity. It was a test of preparation, where the winners got to see spring again, And the losers, well, they fed the soil come thaw. There's a superstition whispered by the older villagers. If your shadow freezes, your soul follows. Total nonsense, of course. Or is it? One woman swears her brother died after walking out on a full moon night without his boots. Was it frostbite? Or a spirit? Historians still argue whether these beliefs were coping mechanisms or genuine fear responses. Because let's face it, when survival hangs by a thread, every creak in the night sounds like death knocking. You notice something peculiar in the corner of the room. A bundle of cloth and fur. It stirs. Not a pet. It's a child, swaddled tight like a burrito, sleeping next to a pig for warmth. That's right. Livestock in the house wasn't just practical, it was strategic. And yes, we'll talk more about that soon. For now, feel the rough wool cloak draped around your shoulders, scratchy but effective. Listen to the fire pop, smell the burning peat, and marvel at how every corner of this home is designed not for beauty, but for survival. Even the roof, thatched with straw, holds pockets of trapped air, primitive insulation. Genius, right? You're beginning to appreciate how little these peasants had, and how much they made it work. You don't see luxury, but you do see wisdom earned through generations of trial, error, and just enough success to pass the knowledge on. And if you're starting to feel cozy, just remember, outside that thin wooden door, the wind howls like a wolf in the trees. You are never more than one bad winter away from ruin. You wake to the soft creaking of wood above your head and the sharp, biting cold that somehow wormed its way under your cloak. The hearth fire is little more than a red glowing nest of coals now, but it's still the warmest place in the house. You sit up slowly, your joints stiff, and feel every chill the wattle and daub walls failed to block. Which, to be honest, is most of them. Let's talk about that house. It's not much. More shed than shelter by modern standards. You glance around at the wonky timber frame, the uneven floor of packed earth, and the low, sloping ceiling where frost clings like spider webs. And yet, it's engineered in its own way. That crooked little home is built to ride out a medieval winter with more cleverness than it gets credit for. The walls, for starters. Wattle and daub isn't glamorous, but it's the peasant version of eco-architecture. Thin wooden rods, woven together into a lattice, then plastered with a sludge of clay, soil, straw, and animal dung. Yep, literal poop. It sounds disgusting until you realize it works. The mixture hardens into a crude but sturdy thermal barrier. Not airtight, but better than sleeping under a tree. Then there's the thatched roof, a messy masterpiece made from bundles of straw or reeds layered so thick that water rolls right off. But here's the trick. Thatch isn't just waterproof, it traps air. Air, you now realize with surprising appreciation, is insulation. Peasants didn't know the chemistry, but they knew the effect. A thick thatch keeps the worst of the cold out, even when snow stacks on top like icing. Still, cold seeps in. Always. So what do? You build low to the ground, close to the fire, with small windows or none at all. Glass is for nobles and churches. You get oiled parchment, animal bladder, or just wooden shutters. Let the light in, keep the wind out. Well, mostly. Drafts were part of life. That's why the family huddled in the one warm room, sleeping close together under layers of wool and straw. Heating the whole house? Please. They didn't even try. You hear movement behind you. Someone's already outside, brave or foolish. Turns out the cold is everywhere. So smart peasants fought it not just with walls, but with layout. They knew where to place their homes. Southern exposure if possible, for more daylight. Windbreaks like tree lines or fences to slow the icy gusts. Some even built partially into hillsides, natural insulation. Historians still argue whether peasants had a true architectural strategy, or if their homes were just whatever they could slap together. But spend one winter night here, and it becomes clear. Even improvisation breeds genius when survival's on the line. You rub your hands together and peer toward the ceiling. Smoke still drifts lazily upward through the thatch, escaping without a chimney. That's right, no chimney, just a hole in the roof. Or sometimes no hole at all. You'd think that's a problem, but it's part of the plan. Smoke curls up, and while annoying to the lungs and eyeballs, it carries a surprise benefit. It chokes out insects. Lice, fleas, and mites hate it. It also helps dry out the damp straw and wooden beams. So yes, you cough through your stew, but you don't freeze quite as fast, and your house doesn't rot out from under you. The floor beneath you isn't wood. It's hard-packed dirt, sometimes with straw thrown over it like a poor man's carpet. Cold seeps up from below, which is why you sleep raised if you can. Simple wooden platforms, maybe a bit of hay. Nothing fancy, just enough to put a little space between you and the freezing earth. One of the weirder details you notice? Animal skin stuffed into the gaps between the beams. Not decorations, draft blockers. And in the corners, rags twisted like ropes and shoved between planks. Homemade weather stripping. You grin a little. Turns out medieval peasants invented all the hacks before Pinterest did. There's even a rumor, half history, half folklore, that some families would pack dried dung into the cracks for extra insulation. Not just for the walls, but for plugging gaps in shoes, cloaks, or even mittens. Is it true? Historians still debate it, but the idea makes your own socks feel incredibly luxurious. You shuffle toward the door. There's no foyer, of course, just a single wooden panel held closed by a leather strap. Some peasants used heavy animal hides as door flaps, overlapping like a medieval version of thermal curtains. You peek outside and immediately feel your eyelashes try to freeze. The wind bites, but the rising sun glows orange behind the frosted treetops. Not every house was this simple. In some parts of Europe, especially among wealthier peasants or those closer to towns, multi-room houses existed, even upper floors. But for most, one room, one fire, one shot at staying alive each winter night. And in that room, nothing goes to waste. The walls may not be smooth, but they're useful. Hooks for hanging cloaks close to the fire, a shelf for candles, a peg for your one pair of boots. Even the ceiling beams double as drying racks for herbs, meat, or the damp socks you hung up yesterday. You can still smell them. Yikes. Despite the hardship, you notice a weird kind of beauty in the design. Everything has a purpose. There's no clutter, no wasted space, and no illusions. The house isn't pretending to be comfortable. It's a tool for survival, and you respect it more with each shiver. So next time your central heating kicks on automatically, maybe think of the medieval peasant up at dawn, patching his roof with frozen mud, hoping the wind doesn't tear off a wall this year. He didn't build for comfort. He built to live another day. And so do you, for now, as you head back to the hearth and nudge the coals to life with a stick. A new day begins, and with it, the same quiet promise. Don't freeze, don't fail. Spring will come, eventually. You stretch your legs under the bench and instantly regret it. The stone floor beneath is as cold and unforgiving as betrayal. The fire's been stoked back to life now, warming the immediate area, but your toes are still flirting with frostbite. You glance over at the family still curled up in a heap under a mountain of rough wool and fur. And here's where you learn one of medieval winter's most reliable survival hacks. Don't sleep alone. Let's talk about beds, or what passes for beds. In this humble peasant home, there's usually only one, maybe two if you're lucky or unusually rich for your class. but they're nothing like your plush modern mattress. Think wooden frame, if that, topped with a bag of straw, or if you're fancy dried moss or feathers. The term mattress is being extremely generous here. It's more of a suggestion than a comfort. But what matters most isn't what you sleep on, it's what or who you sleep with. Not in the romantic way. In the, if we don't press our freezing limbs together like meat in a sandwich, we're gonna die kind of way. The entire family, mom, dad, 6 kids, and maybe a grandma or 2, slept in the same bed, bundled like a human burrito. Sometimes they'd even throw in a dog or a goose for extra warmth. Is it cozy? Yes. Is it uncomfortable, smelly, and an introvert's worst nightmare? Also, yes. Peasants didn't bat an eye. They understood body heat as a renewable resource. The more people, the warmer the pile. There's no shame in a tangle of elbows and knees if it keeps you from freezing in your sleep. Historians still argue whether this was a universally accepted practice or just a necessity in poorer households. Either way, it worked. Your own body temperature becomes your most loyal little furnace. You curl up next to a young boy wrapped in what used to be a cloak and now functions as a makeshift blanket. His breath comes in steady puffs, and you notice how even the air inside the house frosts slightly when people speak. No such thing as room temperature here. The room is the temperature. So you pull the rough wool tighter, and the scratchiness is almost welcome. Wool, by the way, was the MVP of winter fabrics. Not soft, not sleek, but water-resistant, durable, and insulating even when wet. Every layer counted, and peasants layered up like cake. At night, the clothes stayed on. You didn't slip into PJs. You wore your survival gear to bed. Some families didn't even bother with traditional beds. In certain regions, people made use of elevated platforms near the hearth. They were basically wide, flat shelves above the fire, where smoke rose up and warmed the space. Smoke that also made your lungs feel like they were filled with soup. But that's just flavor, right? Others slept in wall alcoves or under thick hay piles in barns. If you were a farmhand or servant, you might literally sleep on the hay, under a crusty blanket that hadn't been washed since the last plague. There are even tales, maybe true, maybe folktale, of people sleeping in the oven. Not while it was blazing, of course. But once the baking was done and the heat lingered, the low brick cavity of the bread oven became the warmest nook in the house. You'd slip in, curl up like a loaf, and try not to suffocate. Cozy, huh? If you didn't have access to warmth like that, you got creative. Heated stones wrapped in cloth could be placed at the foot of the bed. Same with bricks or even roasted turnips. Yes, really. Anything that retained heat. You'd heat it in the fire, wrap it up, and stuff it under the covers like a medieval hot water bottle. It might not last all night, but it took the edge off enough to fall asleep. Fleas, lice, and bedbugs were, naturally, an accepted part of this entire ecosystem. Bathing was rare in winter, not because people were lazy, but because getting wet could literally kill you. So yes, your sleeping pile was warm, but it also wriggled. And you didn't have the luxury of caring too much. Cleanliness was for summer. Winter was for warmth and survival. One fringe detail that might make you raise an eyebrow. In some areas, peasants hung dried herbs or stuffed sachets under pillows and near bedding. Lavender, tansy, rosemary, not just for smell, but as insect repellents. It didn't eliminate the critters, but it helped. Kind of like putting air freshener in a portable toilet. A gesture of hope, if nothing else. There's a superstition that if you slept too close to the wall in winter, your soul could be sucked out through the stones. Or that malevolent spirits lived in cold corners, just waiting for you to drift off and let your guard down. That's why some villagers tucked their children toward the middle of the bed pile, far from the chill and the darkness. Whether you believe the ghosts or not, It's hard to deny that the warm center of a human huddle was the safest spot on a frigid night. You lie back now, head resting on a bundle of cloth that smells like old onions and wet sheep. Not ideal, but slowly, you start to understand how people made peace with it. The fire's low, the wind outside howls, but the walls, thin as they are, still hold. You're not comfortable, not by a long shot, but you're alive. And in a world where winter can kill you in your sleep, that's enough. The mother rises quietly, steps over her children, and moves to the hearth to warm a pot of milk and oats. Her breath clouds the air as she works, every movement silent and practiced. You realize she's been doing this every morning for decades. No alarms, no soft slippers, just bare feet on stone, and a hope that this fire, this day, will carry the family one more step toward spring. You shiver, then smile. Somehow, despite the cold, despite the lice, despite the complete lack of orthopedic support in these straw mattresses, there's something weirdly comforting in it all, like the house is a living thing, groaning, smoky, imperfect, but trying its best to keep you safe. And you? You just keep breathing, bundled in a pile of peasants, under a ceiling that leaks and a blanket that smells faintly of cow. But hey, you're not frozen. And in this world, that's a victory. You blink your eyes open again to pale daylight creeping in through a gap in the wall. Morning has truly arrived, though it still feels like the inside of an icebox. You sit up with a groan, peeling a stiff cloak from your legs. The embers have dimmed. Breath still clouds before your face. And breakfast? That's not a luxurious sit-down. It's a tactical operation to fuel your body before facing the brutal outdoors. Your host ladles a scoop of something thick and steaming into a wooden bowl. It's not much to look at. Gray, lumpy, and vaguely earthy smelling. But this unremarkable gruel, it might be your best defense against the cold. Food in winter isn't just about survival, it's strategy. Calories equal warmth. And for a medieval peasant, staying warm means eating smart, even when options are few. You take a cautious bite. It's barley porridge, thick with bits of root vegetables. Maybe a sliver of dried meat if you're lucky. Spiced? Ha! Try salted. If flavor makes an appearance, it's probably by accident. But don't scoff. That bowl of gruel is actually a tiny miracle. Think about it. Harvested months ago, dried or stored in a cellar, and still edible in the dead of winter. Medieval peasants were food hoarders by necessity. Without refrigeration or supermarkets, they had to plan for winter like squirrels on a deadline. And they were good at it. Grains like barley, rye, and oats were lifesavers. They could be dried, stored in sacks, or ground into flour for bread and mush. Roots like turnips, carrots, and onions held well in underground pits or straw-lined cellars. Dried beans and peas added protein. Fermented foods like sauerkraut offered vitamins, even when everything else turned mushy. Historians still argue whether peasant diets were as bleak as often described, or if they were just unexciting but adequate. But one thing's certain: calories were king, and fat was your thermal armor. If you had access to butter or lard, you were rich in warmth. Literally. Some folks even stirred spoonfuls of pig fat into soups like it was medieval cream. And here's where things get truly genius. Peasants knew how to stretch everything. You sip from a wooden cup filled with ale. Yes, ale in the morning. Water was often unsafe or frozen solid, so weak ale was a daily staple. It had enough alcohol to kill bacteria, but not enough to leave you tipsy. Think of it as medieval Gatorade. Plus, it warmed your belly and gave a bit of that liquid courage for facing chores in sub-zero air. Then comes the bread. Coarse, dense, and dark. Not the fluffy white kind the lords enjoy. This is black rye bread or maslin, a rough combo of grains, heavy enough to double as a doorstop. But it fills your gut and soaks up the gruel nicely. In colder areas, people kept loaves near the hearth so they wouldn't freeze into bricks. If you're extra fortunate, maybe there's some cheese, salty and hard, aged in a cloth that smells like old feet. But it's protein and fat, and it keeps you going. Same with preserved meats. Smoking, salting, and drying were your only options to save meat through the months when animals stopped grazing and started dropping from frost. You eat in silence, as everyone does, huddled around the fading fire, spoons scraping wooden bowls. It's not a feast, but it's ritual. Every bite counts. You chew slowly, because there may not be much more until sundown. And just when you think the meal's over, someone pulls a small crock from under the table. It's a little pot of honey or jam, maybe made from berries foraged months ago and boiled down into a thick paste. You get one dab, just a taste, but it sends a warm thrill through your system. Sugar. Precious sugar. Not a regular guest at the table, but a welcome one. Fringe households, especially those near forests, got even more creative. Boiled tree bark, pine needle broth, and even roasted acorns show up in desperate winters. Not delicious, but packed with nutrients. There's even mention in some records of soup made from stale bread, water, and leftover ashes. Sounds awful, and probably was, but ash contains trace minerals, and when you're starving, minerals become gourmet. You glance out the narrow window. A neighbor lugs a basket toward your door, wrapped in a blanket. It's a food trade, maybe onions for lard, or beans for some salted fish. Bartering was the village safety net. If your harvest failed or your supplies ran low, you depended on others. Not out of kindness, necessarily, but mutual survival. You step outside to greet them. The cold slaps your cheeks. But your belly is warm now, and that makes all the difference. You trade your last turnip and 2 eggs for a half-wheel of rough goat cheese. Fair deal. You tuck it under your arm like treasure and step back inside. There's a moment of quiet pride as you set it on the table. The family nods. This cheese might be part of dinner, or it might last a week. Either way, it's one more barrier between you and hunger, and that, in winter, is everything. People often forget. Peasant ingenuity didn't just happen in the field. It happened in kitchens, or what passed for them. Tiny hearths, smoky beams, clay pots hung from hooks, meals cooked slowly over embers, while someone stirred and someone else blew on the fire like their life depended on it. Because it did. You settle in again, watching as breakfast turns into chores. The bowls are cleaned with hay and cold water. The scraps go to the chickens or pigs. Nothing is wasted. The ash from the fire, scooped into a bucket and saved for lye. Even bones are boiled again for broth, until they snap like twigs. In this world, winter isn't poetic. It's war, and every calorie is a shield, every hot bowl a victory. You sit a little taller. Your belly is full, your fingers are only kind of numb, and outside, a crow calls as if to remind you, spring is far off, but not impossible. The cold waits just outside the threshold, a silent dare. After breakfast, you step back into the frigid air, your breath fogging like dragon smoke. And suddenly, it hits you. Food may warm your belly, but winter survival also depends on what you wear, or more accurately, how you layer. Because let's be clear, medieval peasants didn't have closets full of stylish winter coats. You dressed like an onion, or you didn't survive. Your base layer? A scratchy linen shirt, always linen, never cotton, because it simply wasn't around yet for peasants in most of Europe. This shirt clings to your skin like a second, unpleasantly abrasive layer of dermis. But linen has its perks. It wicks moisture, dries fast, and doesn't fall apart after repeated wear. Which is good, because you'll be wearing this same shirt for the next 5 months, without a wash. Over that goes your woolen tunic, now slightly stiff from last night's condensation. Wool is the reigning champ of cold weather fabrics. It holds heat like it's hoarding secrets. Even wet wool keeps you warm, kind of like soggy toast, still edible in a pinch. You add a belt to keep it in place, tucking your knife and a pouch with a few stale crumbs. Then come the leg coverings. Not trousers exactly, more like woolen tubes tied at the waist. You slide them on with effort. If you're lucky, you've got proper hose, stitched from thick wool, maybe patched with leather at the knees. Your calves already ache from yesterday's walking. This won't help. Shoes? They're laughably thin, often just leather uppers stitched to a flat sole. No laces, no arch support, no insulation. If you're really poor, you wrap your feet in cloth and stuff them into wooden clogs or rawhide moccasins. If you're clever, you line them with hay. Yes, hay. Fluffy, dry insulation that tickles your toes and delays frostbite for at least another hour. Historians still argue whether peasants ever owned more than one full outfit. Some records say yes, maybe a summer tunic and a winter one. Others insist most people wore the same garments day and night, repairing them endlessly. Evidence from wills, inventories, and even grave finds remains conflicting. What we do know, clothing was too precious to own in abundance, so layering and patching were your primary tools. And now the pièce de résistance, your outer cloak. Heavy wool again, woven so thick it stands on its own. It's fastened at the shoulder with a brooch or simple knot. This cloak is both your jacket and your blanket. It shields you from sleet, snow, wind, and judgment. It might also be lined with sheepskin if you're lucky, or if you stole it from a richer cousin. Peasants with a little flair, sometimes stitched in fur trims, usually rabbit or squirrel. Yes, squirrels. You never look at a cute woodland creature the same after you've skinned one for warmth. And while we're on oddities, here's a fringe tidbit. In some Slavic regions, old cloaks were waterproofed with a coating of pig fat or fish oil. Smelly? Absolutely. But also rain-resistant and fashion-forward in a kind of medieval Viking way. Gloves were rare. Mittens, even rarer. You might have a pair of simple hand wraps, strips of cloth wound tightly around your fingers like makeshift boxing tape. If you had proper mittens, you guarded them like treasure. Because once your hands froze, your ability to do anything else followed. And let's not forget headgear. Heat escapes from your head faster than a secret at a feast. Most peasants wore hoods sewn directly into their cloaks. These cowls were large enough to cover the head and neck, and sometimes even doubled as scarves. Some families passed them down like heirlooms. If you squint, they're like the medieval version of a hoodie, comfortably medieval chic. You pull your own hood up now, adjusting it around your ears. The fabric smells faintly of smoke and sheep. Not unpleasant. And suddenly, you understand why so many portraits of peasants show everyone swaddled like toddlers. Fashion was a luxury. Warmth was a necessity. You layered until your movement was restricted, and your silhouette resembled a stack of laundry. But you stayed alive. Button technology, by the way, wasn't common for peasants. Laces, ties, and pins were more accessible. You might use bone toggles or wooden clasps. If your cloak had a button, it probably came from an older relative, or from someone who didn't need it anymore, if you catch my drift. So now you're fully dressed. You weigh an extra 10 pounds in wool. You can't bend at the waist. Your boots are questionable at best. But you're ready to face the snow. And honestly, you're warmer than you expected. Not comfortable, but functional. Your host hands you a pair of thick, smelly socks, the kind that double as emergency mittens if things go south. You accept them with quiet gratitude. You won't need them now, but you will need them later, when the sun sets and the wind gets mean. It's worth noting that some villages even practiced a form of rotational dressing, where the warmest outer layers were rotated among family members depending on who had the most urgent outdoor tasks. One day it's your turn to brave the well or check on the animals. The next, someone else wears the precious fur-lined hood, a communal wardrobe with no room for ego. By the way, remember that weird little superstition from earlier about walls stealing souls? There's another one. If you don't cover your head at night, your thoughts will freeze. It was believed that ideas, memories, and even dreams could get stuck in your brain if it became too cold. So peasants often slept in their caps, hoods, or wrapped their heads in cloth. It wasn't just superstition. It was insulation, disguised as folk wisdom. You give yourself one last check, like a night before battle. Everything's in place, layers secured, cloak drawn tight. The wind howls through the cracks in the door like a warning. And you step outside anyway, because in this world, winter doesn't care how stylish you are. But it will show mercy, sometimes, to those who dress like they expect to survive. You trudge into the snowdrift, wool flapping around your legs like soggy sails. The village looks like a half-forgotten diorama, smoke curling from chimneys, chickens hopping from foot to foot, and frost ramming every timber beam in a sugar-like crust. And yet, as bleak as it appears, there's a hidden network keeping all this running. Chores. Relentless, repetitive, and weirdly ingenious chores. Because in winter, survival isn't just about what you do. It's about how often you do it without freezing your fingers off. First stop, the well. The bucket's already frozen to the lip. You wedge it loose with a stick, teeth chattering, hands already going stiff despite your woolen wraps. Drawing water in winter was like wrestling with an angry ghost. The rope creaks as you lower the bucket down into the dark. If you're lucky, there's water near the surface. If not, it's pickaxe time, breaking through ice just to reach the basic essence of life. Most villages didn't have fancy indoor plumbing. Shocking, I know. So the communal well was everything. And if the well froze solid, people turned to rivers, streams, or even collected snow. Yes, snow. But before you imagine anyone delicately sipping melted flakes, remember? Snow is a cold sponge for bacteria. Boiling was essential, if you had enough firewood, which was a whole other battle. You carry the sloshing bucket back toward the cottage, muscles burning. It's heavy, it's cold. It spills on your boots and immediately starts to freeze. But water isn't optional. It's needed for cooking, drinking, cleaning, and keeping the animals alive. Speaking of animals, it's time to visit the livestock. You cross the icy yard, crunching frost underfoot. A low barn squats nearby, its door groaning open like it resents being disturbed. Inside, the air is a little warmer, dense with steam and the sour smell of manure. Welcome to the peasant heating system. See, animals weren't just food or tools, they were heaters with hooves. Cows, pigs, and goats gave off an astonishing amount of body heat, and peasants used this to their advantage. In many places, people built byres or longhouses where humans and animals shared a roof. You slept on one side, the cow family snored on the other. Cozy? Sort of. Smelly? Absolutely. But effective? Oh yes. Historians still debate how common this living arrangement was. Some argue it was widespread across colder regions like Scandinavia and the Alps. Others believe it was limited to specific cultural pockets. But one thing's clear. Where winters bit hardest, walls were too precious to waste separating heat sources. You refill the hay troughs with what's left from the stack, now shrunk to a worrying size. Hay was gold. You couldn't let it get wet, moldy, or depleted too soon, or your animals would starve, and you'd follow. You check their water bowls, frozen solid. Again. You sigh. Setting the metal bowl by the fire later is the only way to get it drinkable again. While you're scooping muck, your neighbor passes by pulling a sled laden with, what else? Manure. Frozen, fragrant, and fated to be fertilizer once the thaw comes. Even waste had a purpose. Peasants composted everything they could. Nothing was thrown away. Your compost heap might look like a medieval garbage pile, but it was actually the base of next season's survival. There's a genius in this rhythm. Every chore interlocks. You collect water to boil snow. You feed animals so they keep your home warm. You gather manure to enrich your spring crops. Nothing is idle. Even winter is just the other half of the growing season. You grab a thatch broom and sweep the icy threshold of the cottage. Not for cleanliness, really, but to prevent buildup that could freeze the door shut. Then you check the chimney stack. Blockages from snow or birds could smoke you out. Or worse, trap carbon monoxide and knock everyone out by morning. The fire had to breathe too. Then it's time for fuel. Wood, peat, or dried animal dung. Whatever burns, you collect. You're not just stockpiling for the hearth, you're calculating hours of warmth. Medieval homes had no insulation beyond what you wore. A good fire could mean the difference between a cozy evening and waking up with frost-bitten toes. And here's a strange but true fringe tip. Some peasants in Central Europe burned bones. Yes, bones. Animal bones, left over from butchery, were dried and tossed into the hearth when fuel was low. They burned hot and long and made a sound somewhere between sizzling bacon and a haunted xylophone. Weird, but functional. You drag in a bundle of twigs, shaking snow from your shoulders. Your muscles ache, your gloves are soaked, and your nose is red enough to signal ships. But chores aren't over yet. There's always mending, clothes to stitch, thatch to reweave, tools to sharpen. Winter wasn't a vacation from labor. It just changed the type of labor. If anything, it became more technical. You had to fix everything without access to proper supplies or heat. People got incredibly crafty. Broken rake? Tie it with gut string. Torn tunic? Stitch it with horsehair, out of twine, twist dry nettles. Even soap had to be homemade. Lye from ash, mixed with animal fat. A cauldron of foul-smelling promise that kept at least the illusion of hygiene alive. And every so often you'd visit a neighbor, trading eggs for wool or gossip for salt. Yes, even in deep winter, people made the rounds, partly for survival, partly to make sure nobody had frozen in their sleep. Villages operated like one big organism. If one part froze, the rest didn't function. As the sun begins to sink, you return to the cottage. The chores are done, at least until morning. The fire's burning low, the bread is thawing by the hearth, and you, miraculously, are still breathing. No knights, no battles, no glory. Just water hauled, cows fed, snow shoveled, and one clever peasant standing tall. Medieval winter wasn't conquered with strength. It was endured with repetition, routine, and a very good broom. The sun slips behind the hills like it's escaping responsibility, and the sky purples into a bruised twilight. That eerie silence settles over the village, the kind where every creak sounds suspicious, and every gust of wind feels personal. You push open the cottage door and step inside, stomping the snow from your makeshift boots. Now comes the most sacred of medieval rituals, staying warm without catching on fire. The hearth crackles in the center of the room. It's not big. In fact, it's barely more than a circle of stones with a spit above and a hook for the pot. There's no chimney, just a smoke hole in the roof that's half clogged with soot. The air smells like burnt onion, wet wool, and faintly despair. But hey, it's warmer than outside. You huddle near the hearth, grateful. The heat only reaches a few feet in every direction, so positioning matters. This isn't just a fireplace, it's the beating heart of the home. And like any heart, it needs constant feeding. Twigs first, then larger logs or, more likely, peat bricks. Maybe some dung patties. Fire is fire. Historians still argue whether central hearths were more efficient than wall-mounted fireplaces in medieval peasant homes. Some claim the central setup allowed better ambient heating. Others insist the lack of a chimney made for dangerously smoky air, especially in tightly sealed homes. What's undeniable? For all their smoke and soot, these hearths were essential and deeply communal. You glance up. Hanging from a rafter is a blackened iron cauldron, bubbling with whatever the families managed to scrape together, maybe a few turnips, lentils, and a hunk of pork fat. It smells edible. You pull your cloak tighter and sit down on the packed earth floor. This is the warmest part of the evening, the post-chore, pre-bedtime glow when the fire's still lively and fingers haven't yet stiffened. Now, let's talk heat hacks, because medieval peasants had no thermostats, but they did have some surprisingly clever tricks up their sleeves. First up, heated stones. You toss a few smooth rocks near the flames, wait until they're good and toasty, then wrap them in cloth and place them at your feet or in your bedding. Instant medieval hot water bottle, minus the water. Smart, right? Just don't forget which stones are hot before sitting on them. That's a lesson you only learn once. Another favorite? The bed companion. No, not that kind. This was usually a dog, cat, or goat allowed into bed specifically for body heat. Children slept together for the same reason. Pile them up like kindling. Larger families often packed a single bed like sardines, rotating who got the warmest spot near the wall. You, tonight, are sandwiched between two brothers who snore like livestock. There's even a weird little fringe tale about a peasant family in Flanders that supposedly trained a pig to sleep at the foot of the bed to warm their feet. Whether it's true or just excellent storytelling is up for debate, but hey, it's technically multitasking. Above the hearth hangs drying laundry. It steams gently in the firelight. You can't afford to let anything freeze after washing, so garments hang near the flames, even if they pick up a whiff of smoke in the process. It's better than the smell of mildew. And let's not forget the hooded nightcap, a necessary item in the peasant bedtime ensemble. This soft, pointy piece of cloth kept your head warm and your dreams unfrozen. Fashionable? Not remotely. But again, this isn't about style points. It's about making it to spring without turning into a popsicle. You shift closer to the fire. Your toes have thawed just enough to sting. Someone pokes the embers with an iron poker. Sparks leap like fireflies, briefly illuminating the soot-streaked ceiling. Every movement is slow now, as if your muscles have resigned themselves to the cold. Firewood is precious. Every stick burned is one less for tomorrow. So after dinner, whatever thin stew you've scraped together, it's time to bank the fire. That means raking the hot coals into a pile and covering them with ash. It chokes the flame, but preserves the heat, allowing you to rekindle it in the morning without starting from scratch. Here's a fun fact. Peasants often carried embers between homes in small covered pots called fire dogs, or chafing pots. It was easier than trying to light a fire from flint every time. Fire starting was an event, not a casual spark. And if your fire went out entirely, you might visit a neighbor's house with a ladle and a hopeful expression. Borrowing fire wasn't just kindness, it was survival. Whole communities sometimes kept one flame alive year-round to ensure no one went without. The shadows stretch long across the floor. The warmth begins to fade. You wrap your cloak tighter, now transformed into a sleeping bag. You lie on a straw mattress near the fire, knowing that by morning, your breath will hang in the air again, and the fight for warmth will begin anew. But for now, you listen to the soft pop of the coals. Maybe you press a warm stone to your belly. Maybe a cat curls up behind your knees. It's not luxury. It's barely comfort. But in the brittle heart of winter, these humble warmth hacks mean you get one more night. And one more night can be everything. Morning hits you like a damp slap. The fire's gone sullen, little more than a pile of gray ash and cold regrets. Your nose is frozen. Your breath fogs in front of your face like your part steam engine. Welcome to the medieval peasant wake-up call. No alarms, just frostbite looming politely by the door. You fumble for the coals you banked under ash last night. Still warm? You lucked out. You blow gently, nudging the embers with a twist of dry straw and a prayer. Slowly, flames twitch to life again. No one talks yet. Everyone's moving like they're 90 years old, aching, cracking, mumbling as they roll off their straw mats. Now comes the first real decision of the day: whether to eat. Food isn't guaranteed in winter, not unless you planned absurdly well, which most peasants couldn't afford to do. So breakfast is either a thin gruel of barley and water, or, on lucky days, coarse rye bread, dense, sour, and sometimes so old it needs to be dipped in hot broth just to chew. And here's a fun and slightly gross fact. If you had a bit of ale to soften the bread, even better. Small beer, weak, low-alcohol home brew, was safer than water in many places and drank by everyone from toddlers to grandmas. Because apparently tipsy and hydrated beats dead from dysentery. With a crust in your hand and no coffee in sight, it's time to head to the food stores. You step outside into the bite of morning, your fingers instantly numb. The snow crunches like bone underfoot, and your breath coils in the air like fog from a dragon's nose. The food storage shed is just a small side building, more like a glorified cupboard. Inside, shelves hold clay jars, woven baskets, and linen-wrapped bundles. What's left of your winter provisions is lined up like tiny treasure. Dried beans, salted pork, smoked fish, a few knobby root vegetables, and, if you're incredibly lucky, a wheel of hard cheese aging in a corner like a savory miracle. Medieval peasants had to think months ahead. Everything that went into this shed was preserved at the height of harvest. Smoking, drying, fermenting, salting, pickling. These weren't culinary choices. They were life insurance policies. You unwrap a bundle of wrinkled apples. Still edible, if not exactly crisp. Apples were a favorite winter fruit because they stored well in cool, dry spaces. And don't forget cabbage. Medieval folks loved a good cabbage. It was like their version of kale. Tough, versatile, and capable of surviving the apocalypse. Some peasants even buried root vegetables in pits lined with straw and leaves to keep them from freezing. It sounds dramatic, but hey, it worked. And when something did go bad, it went into the soup pot anyway. A bit of mold? Scrape it. A little slimy? Boil it longer. Waste nothing. Historians still debate whether medieval diets were as grim as they sound. Some argue that in good years, peasants ate a surprisingly balanced diet rich in fiber and minerals. Others point to archaeological evidence of malnutrition, stunted growth, and rickets. The truth likely swings between the two. Famine was seasonal, but so were feasts. Back inside, someone starts a porridge pot. You toss in whatever you've scrounged, a bit of dried onion, a chunk of carrot, even a strip of smoked fish if you're feeling wild. Flavor is a luxury, but warmth is non-negotiable. The porridge bubbles over low flame, thick and bland. You eat it slowly, grateful for the heat more than the taste. Now and then, you dream of summer, berries so ripe they burst in your hand, fresh milk, bread still warm from the oven. But that's months away. Right now, every meal is a math problem. How much can you eat today without starving tomorrow? Then there are the fringe survival hacks, like soaking stale bread in boiled nettle water, or making a makeshift flour out of crushed acorns, though they had to be leached of their bitterness first, or they'd make your stomach riot. Some villages even made jelly from boiled animal hooves. Technically edible, dubiously appetizing. You lean back, full-ish. The warmth from the fires creeping outward again, making it almost bearable to sit still. Someone offers you a sliver of cheese, aged so long it could probably vote in local elections. You accept it like it's gold. Later, you help seal the remaining food stores, wax over jars, cloth tied tight, baskets stacked high. Anything that invites mold, rats, or insects has to be protected. Cats help, if you've got them. If not, you lay out ash or flour near the base of walls to check for tiny paw prints. And here's a weird little gem. Some households believed in hanging carved turnips over their stores to ward off spoilage spirits. Basically, proto-jack-o'-lanterns with a job. Did they work? Who knows? But it was worth a shot. As the day stretches on, you prep food not just for now, but for later. More soup gets made and stored in cold corners. Bread is baked if flour allows. The oven, really just a clay dome heated by fire, gets hot enough for one round before cooling again for hours. Timing is everything. By evening, you're back by the fire, sipping a thin broth and gnawing on what might be the world's chewiest rye crust. Your belly isn't exactly full, but it's not empty. And in medieval winter, that's enough to count as success. You look around at the faces of your family, their cheeks flushed, their eyes heavy. Nobody says it out loud, but you all feel it. Another day survived. Another day closer to thaw. And tomorrow, it begins again. Same meals, same planning, same hunger managed by routine. But now, as the wind howls gently through the rafters, you wrap a blanket around your shoulders, tuck your feet near the embers, and close your eyes. Dinner wasn't a feast, but it was warm, and it was shared. That's enough. The snow outside has crusted into something cruel, sharp at the edges like broken glass. But inside, beneath layers of wool, felt, and thick imagination, you're layering up to leave the house again. Why? Because no matter how brutal the cold, the livestock aren't going to feed themselves. You shuffle out of the cottage with a grimace that could crack stone. Your breath jets like dragon smoke, your fingers already losing sensation. The barn, or what passes for one, is little more than a timber frame smeared with wattle and daub, its gaps stuffed with straw and mud. Wind still snakes through it like it owns the place. The animals greet you with the enthusiasm of grumpy roommates. A couple of chickens, 1 sheep, 2 goats, and if you're lucky, a thin cow that looks perpetually skeptical. Their body heat helps warm the space a little, but only just. You shovel frozen dung, nature's least glamorous winter chore, and lay down hay that's been hoarded like treasure since autumn. Livestock were a medieval peasant's lifeline in winter. Milk, eggs, manure, and in dire cases, meat. Losing a single goat could tip the balance from scraping by to not making it at all. And that's why you treat this frost-bitten barn like a bank vault. Feeding them isn't just routine, it's strategy. You've rationed the hay to last through March, but the goats are eating like it's Mardi Gras. You whisper at them like they understand economics. They ignore you, naturally. You scoop out frozen water from the troughs, breaking the crust with a stick. Some peasants used iron kettles to heat water by the fire, and then haul it outside in shifts. Others just prayed their animals liked popsicles. A few even lined their troughs with heated stones, a fringe technique that's debated to this day. Historians still argue whether this method was widespread, or just a clever outlier from monastic writings. There's also the matter of bedding, because the warmer the animals, the warmer the barn, and that's your backup plan if the cottage fire dies out. So you keep adding straw, creating a thick, insulating mat that slowly builds up through winter. By spring, it's like walking on a squishy hay cake. Smelly? Definitely. But effective? You bet. Ever heard of the deep litter method? Turns out medieval peasants may have invented it by accident. Instead of cleaning out manure daily, they layered fresh straw over old waste. Not only did this keep the barn warmer thanks to composting heat, it also reduced labor. It was gross, but brilliant. And hey, nothing says innovation like sleeping beside your own fertilizer. You check the chickens next. They're moody. They always are in winter. Egg production slows or stops altogether, and you're left wondering if they're secretly freeloaders. But their droppings? Excellent compost. And if you're desperate, there's always chicken stew. It's a dark thought, but you tuck it away for now. Outside the barn, you spot something oddly beautiful. Frost rimming the window of the cottage like lace. Inside, someone's likely boiling mash or weaving. But here, with your boots sunk in straw and your nose red enough to guide a sleigh, you're in survival mode. There's no pasture in winter. No grazing. What the animals eat now is what you stored months ago. And no one's restocking mid-January. You think of the old man down the lane who used to mark the beams of his barn with little notches, one for every bundle of hay left. When the marks reached the floor, he'd walk to the forest and pray. You're not quite there, but you're watching your notches closely. Back at the cottage, your boots leave wet tracks on the floor. You strip the outer layers and settle near the fire. Your gloves are stiff with cold, and, if you're honest, probably some goat. The smell of boiled oats fills the room again. It's the scent of survival. Not variety. Just endurance. Someone stitching patches on a worn tunic. Another person's combing flax, maybe even braiding it into cord. Every moment not spent tending animals is spent mending, planning, or finding new uses for things you'd thought were trash. Even the wax from old candles is being scraped and melted into stubs of new ones. That's another thing. Light. Winter is stingy with daylight, and candles aren't cheap. Most peasants made do with rushlights, thin reeds dipped in fat, which flicker like they're scared of the dark. Reading or sewing by rushlight? Possible, but only barely. Here's a quirky tidbit for you. In some remote villages, folks allegedly tamed fireflies in jars to use as natural nightlights. Sounds ridiculous, right? But then again, medieval minds didn't waste any weird opportunity. Historians don't agree on whether it was myth or misunderstood metaphor, but it's a beautiful idea, isn't it? Evening creeps in fast during winter. One moment you're sipping broth, the next, darkness coils around the edges of the hearth. The animals are bedded, the tools cleaned, the boots drying near the fire. You exhale deeply. The cold presses at the windows like a curious spirit. But for now, you've done all you can. You reflect on the barn's low roof and the huddle of animals inside it. It wasn't just about surviving the cold. It was about sharing it, spreading warmth like resources, one shiver at a time. Tonight, if your fire fails, if the wind finds that one loose panel in the roof, you know where to go. Because sometimes the warmest place in a medieval winter wasn't the hearth. It was the barn. The day wears thin, and the wind outside sounds like a chorus of icy ghosts rattling the eaves. You sit close to the hearth again, hands outstretched, watching sparks float upward like tiny stars that don't want to burn out. Your mind drifts to the clothes draped across the room. Threadbare wool, rough linen, patched and repatched until they're more tapestry than fabric. In medieval winter, your wardrobe wasn't about fashion. It was about armor. Peasant clothing was a layered game of survival strategy. Wool was king, thick, scratchy, and infuriating, but it kept you from becoming a human icicle. Underneath, you'd wear linen shifts, which absorbed sweat and kept skin dry. Because here's a nugget of medieval wisdom. Staying dry was as important as staying warm. Wet clothes? Instant frostbite invitation. Your boots are simple, usually made from tough leather that might be stiff enough to double as a weapon. They were patched endlessly with scraps of hide or cloth. Historians still argue how common sturdy leather boots really were among peasants. Some evidence suggests many went barefoot or wore simple cloth shoes indoors, risking frostbitten toes for comfort. To protect your head and ears from the brutal chill, you'd don a coif, a close-fitting linen cap, often covered by a woolen hood or a thick scarf. Hands were wrapped in fingerless mittens or gloves knitted from sheep's wool, sometimes soaked in animal fat for extra waterproofing. Yeah, medieval peasants had their own version of Gore-Tex, if you squint and imagine really itchy fabric. One quirky but practical tip involved wearing multiple layers of socks. They'd alternate wool and linen socks for insulation and moisture control, a bit like a medieval version of those goofy hiking sock combos you see today. But the real genius? Tucking straw inside your boots to trap heat and absorb moisture. It sounds crazy, but straw-lined boots were surprisingly effective. Just watch out for creepy crawlies. Your outermost layer was usually a cloak or a mantle. Heavy wool blankets with a simple clasp thrown over the shoulders like a wearable tent. These cloaks sometimes had deep hoods to shield faces from biting wind. The cloak wasn't just about warmth, it was also a portable windbreaker and sometimes a makeshift blanket at night. The dye for these clothes was mostly natural. Think muddy browns, muted greens, and dusty reds from roots, berries, and bark. Fashion was not on anyone's mind. The goal was warmth and durability. If your clothes survived the winter, you called that a victory. A fascinating, slightly strange fact. Peasants often used animal fats or oils to waterproof their outerwear. This wasn't just folk legend. There's evidence they rubbed tallow or rendered fats on their wool cloaks to repel rain and snow. Imagine smelling like a bacon strip all winter, but staying dry. Survival trade-off, folks. When you look at the clothes hanging on the line near the fire, you notice the patches. Oh, the patches! Every hole sewn over, every threadbare spot reinforced with scraps from older garments. Medieval peasants were master menders, recycling fabric until it became something unrecognizable, yet still functional. There's a debate among scholars whether this intense patchwork culture was due purely to poverty or if it also had social signaling aspects, kind of a humble brag about resourcefulness. You might be poor, but you don't waste. You mend. You survive. Then there's the nightwear. Yes, medieval peasants wore nightshirts or shifts, usually long and loose for comfort. But warmth was so precious that many simply slept in their day clothes, layering up under wool blankets with heated stones tucked under the covers. Remember those? Life hacks that keep on giving. And here's a wild fringe idea for you. Some peasants reportedly wore warming pads sewn into their clothing, filled with herbs like mugwort or thyme that were believed to generate warmth or ward off chills. Modern science is skeptical, but the placebo effect might have helped. Or maybe they just liked smelling like a medieval herbal shop. At dusk, you notice how your wool cloak traps your breath, turning it to frost. Your mittens make your hands clumsy, but they're better than numb. Your boots crunch in the snow outside, making it sound like 1,000 tiny dry bones breaking with every step. Putting on and taking off these layers was its own kind of daily ritual, a slow dance with survival. You were always balancing heat, moisture, comfort, and durability. Not exactly a walk in the park or the snowdrift. As night deepens, the weight of your woolen cloak feels like a protective shroud, guarding you from the cold horrors outside. You might grumble, you might itch, but it's a small price to pay for the warmth that keeps your blood flowing and your toes intact. So next time you complain about layering up in winter, just think. At least you don't have to wear enough wool to survive a blizzard and smell like a frying pan. Medieval peasants had the ultimate DIY winter wardrobe. Scratchy, smelly, but effective. The fire sputters, casting long shadows that dance across the wooden walls. You watch them flicker while you wrap your hands around a chipped ceramic mug of weak ale, the closest thing to a treat in this frozen season. Ale wasn't just for fun. It was a survival tool, hydration, calories, and sometimes medicine all in one slightly sour sip. Now, think about your water source. Frozen solid outside, streams hidden under snow. Peasants often relied on wells or melted snow, but snow isn't pure H2O, it's a challenge. You'd have to boil it to make it safe, burning precious firewood in the process. Every flame counted. That's why you treasured the winter wells. Wells dug deep enough to avoid freezing. Some villages went so far as to insulate their wells with straw, or built small huts over them to keep out the cold. A quirky medieval innovation? Sure, but life-saving. Remember how we talked about fresh water being scarce? Some peasants resorted to collecting rainwater in the warmer months, storing it in barrels for winter. Historians still argue how effective and common this practice really was. Barrels had to be airtight, or the water would freeze or go bad quickly. Speaking of liquids, medieval peasants also made use of herbal teas, not just for flavor, but for health. Nettles, chamomile, yarrow, and mint were brewed to soothe colds, aid digestion, or simply warm the body. You might have considered yourself an amateur apothecary, mixing whatever you could find. Here's a fun fringe fact. Some accounts mention peasant women using birch bark tea as a mild diuretic or pain reliever. Birch bark, tough and fibrous, doesn't sound like an ideal tea ingredient, but boiled down, it releases a subtle, slightly sweet flavor. Whether it helped or was just a placebo is debated. Back to your ale. It's small beer, a low-alcohol brew that you'd drink by the gallon if you could. Safer than water, more filling than tea, and just enough buzz to keep spirits up without turning you into the village drunk. Ale wasn't only about drinking, either. It was used in cooking, in bread making, and sometimes even in folk remedies. Remember those warming pads we mentioned? Some were soaked in ale for an added kick to the herbal mixture. But winter wasn't just about drinking. You also had to eat what the land gave you: root vegetables, grains, preserved meats, and dried fruits. Harvested in autumn, carefully stored and rationed. Remember that deep storage pit lined with straw? You'd dig in carefully, knowing a rotten turnip could ruin your entire stew. Here's a slightly weird survival hack. Some peasants ate tree bark mixed with flour during famine winters. It was called bark bread, and while it wasn't tasty, it helped stave off starvation. Historians debate whether bark bread was a desperate emergency measure or a more common winter staple. The truth probably lies somewhere in between. At night, when you lie in your bed of straw under heavy blankets, you might dream of fresh vegetables or the first taste of spring greens. But for now, it's all about surviving the long dark. Your breath fogs the air as you blow on your mug, letting the weak ale warm your hands. Outside, the wind howls like a hungry wolf, but inside, you've got the fire, your family, and a mug that says, "I survived another day." The cold is relentless, but so is your spirit. The frost outside has turned the world into a glittering maze, sharp and beautiful, but unforgiving. You step outside for a moment to check the smoke from your chimney. It's thin and steady. Good. That little sign tells you your fire's still burning, your hearth still alive. But winter's chill won't stop you from crafting clever ways to hold on to heat indoors. Peasants were resourceful, of course. One common trick was to build smoke walls inside the house. Simple wooden frames draped with woven mats or blankets hung near the hearth. These acted as partial barriers, slowing drafts and trapping warm air in the main room. Imagine them as medieval room dividers, but with the added bonus of blocking wind that tries to sneak in like an unwanted guest. You might also notice the clever use of bed curtains. Thick wool or heavy linen hung around beds created a microclimate, a tiny heated cocoon. This wasn't just for privacy, but survival. You pulled those curtains tight, cocooned yourself, and suddenly your freezing hut felt a little more like a warm nest. Insulation extended beyond just fabrics. Walls were thick with mud and straw, plastered carefully to block wind and moisture. Some houses had double walls or windbreaks made of wood or earth piled up around them. If you lived near a monastery or castle, you might borrow knowledge from their stone walls that trapped heat better than timber. Historians still debate how common double walls were among peasants, but some evidence points to at least rudimentary windbreaks, often made with stakes and brushwood around cottages. The medieval bed itself was a survival marvel. Stuffed with straw, rushes, or even feathers for those luckier than you, it was layered like an onion. You'd sleep in your wool clothes under thick blankets with heated stones tucked around your feet. These stones were warmed in the fire and then wrapped in cloth to avoid burns. The slow release of heat kept the biting cold at bay through the night. Now, here's a fun fringe fact. Some peasants reportedly slept with warming bricks made from fired clay. little bricks heated in the fire that kept their bed cozy. The practice wasn't widespread, but where it existed, it was a game changer. Candles and rushlights added soft light but little heat. So firewood remained precious. That's why many peasants only kept fires burning during the day. At night, they relied on their clothing and bed setups to keep warm. You can imagine the quiet sounds of a medieval night, the crackle of the dying hearth, the occasional scrape of a curtain, the faint breathing of a family huddled together against the cold. Even in the deep freeze, these small comforts made the difference between shivering and sleeping soundly. Outside, the world is locked in ice, but inside, warmth is layered and earned. Each fabric, each stone, each patch sewn with care is part of a defense against winter's wrath. And you realize survival was as much about creating these little zones of warmth and comfort as it was about fighting the cold directly. So you settle back, nestling under your blankets, the walls holding you tight like a warm hug. Winter might be long, but inside, you have your own little world of heat and hope. The frozen landscape outside is silent, except for the occasional cracking of ice, a stark contrast to the bustling work inside your modest cottage. You're hunched over a table by the firelight, hands busy at a small wooden loom. Weaving, spinning, and sewing are more than crafts here. They're survival tactics. You're producing thread and cloth to patch holes in clothes, mend blankets, and even create makeshift insulation. Every scrap is precious, every knot and stitch an act of defiance against winter's relentless chill. The spinning wheel, though cumbersome, is your best friend during these months of indoor confinement. Wool and flax are your primary fibers. Wool for warmth, flax for lighter garments and linens. Processing flax is a time-consuming, tedious affair involving retting, soaking, drying, breaking, and scutching to separate fibers. During winter, the work slows but never stops. You turn to it to keep busy, productive, and warm. Here's a neat fact. Peasants often reused old clothes as raw material, unraveling worn-out woolen garments to spin new yarn. Recycling at its finest. Historians still argue just how widespread this practice was, but there's plenty of evidence from household inventories noting piles of old wool ready for respinning. A quirky tidbit. Some peasants dyed yarn with natural sources found in the woods and fields: berries, oak galls, even lichens. Colors were dull and earthy, but gave a bit of life to otherwise drab winter wardrobes. Imagine patchwork clothing made from odd bits of dyed yarns and scraps, a medieval quilt of necessity. You can hear the low hum of the spinning wheel's rhythm, a repetitive sound that's somehow comforting, like a lullaby woven into wool. It keeps you grounded, focused, even as the wind howls outside. But it's not just wool and flax you're working with. Animal pelts, especially rabbit and sometimes fox, are prized for extra warmth. They're sewn into linings or fashioned into gloves and hats. A well-placed fur trim can mean the difference between frostbite and cozy fingers. Not every peasant owned pelts, though. Acquiring and preparing fur was a skill often reserved for those with hunting access. That made pelts a kind of status symbol in rural communities. You glance over to a basket filled with feathers. Goose or duck down, carefully collected and saved. Stuffing pillows and beds with feathers was rare, but highly sought after, an indulgence only a few could afford. For the rest, straw and dried grasses did the job. Historians still debate how common feather bedding really was. Some think the references are more legend than widespread reality, but there's no denying that those who had it slept warmer. As your fingers twist fiber into yarn, you marvel at the interconnectedness of every task. The sheep in the barn, the flax fields in summer, the fire in the hearth, the herbs drying on the rafters, all parts of a web that kept winter at bay. By the time your work is done, the room is dim and quiet. Your hands are sore, but your heart is a little warmer, filled with the knowledge that every thread spun is a small victory against the cold. Tomorrow, you'll pick up the needles again, and the winter will continue. But for now, the fire crackles, your clothes are patched, and the cold feels a little less overwhelming. The fire dims to glowing embers, and the wind's howl fades into a soft sigh against the thick walls. Your stomach rumbles, reminding you it's time for dinner, if you can call it that. Food in winter is a puzzle, a game of ration and imagination. Your pantry isn't overflowing with fresh produce. Instead, it's stocked with preserved staples: salted pork, dried fish, root vegetables, and a handful of hard bread that's almost too tough to bite. These stores are your lifeline when the snow traps you indoors for days, sometimes weeks. Salt was the medieval fridge, and peasants knew its worth. Salted meat could last for months if stored properly in cool, dry places. But salt was also expensive, so the quantity you had was limited. You had to ration carefully, savoring each bite. A strange but clever practice involved soaking salted meat in water or broth to reduce the saltiness before cooking, a kind of medieval desalination. It meant extra firewood burned, but made the meat edible and less likely to cause dehydration in the cold. Root vegetables were another staple: turnips, parsnips, carrots, hardy and able to store underground in cellars or pits lined with straw. These cellars were often dug into hillsides, naturally cool and insulated. You'd dig down, bundled in your cloak, to retrieve these food treasures, careful to avoid spoiling. Historians still argue how widespread root vegetable storage was in different regions. Some evidence suggests it was more common in northern Europe than in Mediterranean climates, but everywhere winter forced innovation. Then there's the humble porridge, oats or barley boiled into a thick mush. It was filling, warm, and easy on your firewood supply. You could sweeten it with honey or dried fruits if you were lucky. But mostly, it was just sustenance, eaten slowly while the cold crept around the edges of the hut. A quirky winter food hack. Some peasants mixed ground acorns or chestnuts into their bread or porridge during famine winters. It wasn't tasty, bitter and tough, but it added bulk and calories. Acorn bread was a last resort, a culinary surprise no one wished to repeat. Fermented foods played a vital role too. Sauerkraut and pickled vegetables stored in barrels could last through the winter, providing necessary vitamins. The fermentation process even added warmth to the digestive system, a small but appreciated bonus. You notice the smoky smell of your cooking hearth, mingled with the faint scent of dried herbs hanging from the ceiling: thyme, rosemary, maybe some juniper berries. These weren't just for flavor. They were believed to ward off illness and repel insects. Here's a fun fact. Some peasants believed that eating spicy foods like mustard or horseradish helped heat the body from within. Scientific backing? Not much, but it might have tricked the brain into feeling warmer. Dinner tonight is a simple stew. Bits of salted pork, turnips, onions, and barley. simmered low and slow. It's not gourmet, but the warmth it brings seeps through your bones like a welcome hug. You eat slowly, savoring the heat, knowing this humble meal fuels you for another day battling the cold. Outside, the night deepens, but inside, your belly is full, and your fire burns steady. Winter's grip is fierce, but your kitchen's warmth is fiercer. The cold night stretches on, and you settle down by the flickering hearth, the warmth seeping into your stiff limbs. Outside, the frozen silence presses against your humble cottage. But inside, life pulses quietly with the soft sounds of survival. Your breath forms little clouds as you speak softly to your family, telling stories to keep the darkness at bay. Oral tradition is the medieval internet, where wisdom, warnings, and humor are passed from one generation to the next. These stories often include tips on how to survive the cruelest cold. One favorite tale involves a clever peasant who outwitted the winter by building a miniature greenhouse from glass scraps and animal horn to start seedlings early. Historians still argue whether this was a common practice or just folklore, but it highlights peasant ingenuity in the face of adversity. Your home, simple though it may be, is a web of knowledge stitched together by generations of trial and error. Each wall, each hearth, each worn cloak speaks of resilience. The long nights are not just about endurance, but about community. Neighbors sharing firewood, food, and stories. You recall the odd practice of warming clubs in some villages. Groups of peasants who took turns spending nights in a single heated home to conserve firewood and share warmth. This communal strategy may seem odd to modern sensibilities, but in the freezing months, it was a lifesaver. A quirky but true fact. Peasants sometimes heated their beds by placing hot stones wrapped in cloth beneath the straw mattress, a tradition found in various cold regions. These stones radiated gentle heat, easing the chill that crept under the blankets. There was also the practice of foot warming, massaging and rubbing feet before bed to stimulate circulation, helping stave off frostbite and numbness. You might chuckle at the idea, but science backs it up. Winter was harsh, but it also forced people to innovate. From insulated homes to layered clothing, from rationed food to herbal remedies, every cold hack was a testament to human resilience. And even though the winter might seem endless, the knowledge that spring would come again kept you going. The cold would loosen its grip, the earth would thaw, and life would resume. For now, you close your eyes, the warmth of the fire and family wrapping you in a blanket of security. Sleep beckons, gentle and necessary, as the night deepens. You survived another day? The gray light of dawn barely filters through the frost-covered window, but it's enough to pull you from your straw mattress. You shiver momentarily, reminding yourself why every small ritual matters when the temperature hovers near freezing. Your first act, stoking the embers of the hearth back to life. That gentle glow means warmth, comfort, survival. Medieval peasants often began their day by feeding the fire with whatever dry wood they could scavenge, knowing that a roaring hearth was the heart of the household in winter. They carefully preserved their firewood throughout the colder months, often hoarding it in piles close to the house to avoid frozen hands and wasted trips outside. You might find a stack of logs covered in straw or animal hides to keep them dry and ready. Historians still debate how widespread this practice was, but evidence suggests that peasant households took firewood preservation very seriously. After all, a cold hearth meant a cold body. Here's a quirky detail. Some peasants used leftover bits of charred wood mixed with dried grass as kindling, an early form of fire starter. It wasn't fancy, but it worked, especially when matches were centuries away. Breakfast is a quick, simple affair, a bowl of warm gruel or leftover porridge from last night. It's not gourmet, but it's fuel. You're grateful for the calories, knowing you'll need every ounce of energy to face the day. Now, onto your morning chores. Winter's grip means tending to animals is harder than ever. You trudge through snow to feed the chickens and check on the pigs huddled in their pens. Animal care was a full-time job in itself, requiring early rising and constant vigilance. Frozen water troughs had to be broken and refilled, and feed rationed carefully. It's no wonder peasants prized their animals. They were warmth, food, and livelihood all in one. Wool from sheep, milk from goats, eggs from chickens. Each small gift made winter a bit more bearable. You wrap your hands around a warm bucket, grateful it's not icy cold. Frozen water buckets were a daily annoyance. Some villages had heated animal shelters, but most relied on layering straw and manure for insulation. Yes, manure. Odd as it sounds, it was a surprisingly effective insulator, trapping heat and protecting animals from the worst of the cold. Historians still argue about how common manure insulation was versus other methods, but it's a recurring theme in rural winter survival strategies. By mid-morning, your body warms, despite the biting wind outside. You take a moment to breathe in the crisp air, sharp, clean, and biting, reminding you that winter is no joke. And yet, despite the hardships, there's a rhythm to these days, a cycle of care, work, and resilience that stitches the cold season into something almost bearable. You smile, knowing that every morning stoke of the fire, every care given to animals, is a small victory over the long, merciless winter. The sun sits low in the sky, casting pale light over the snow-packed village as you venture outside to check the fields, or rather, the frozen wasteland that once was your livelihood. Winter has you hemmed in, but even in this dormant season, there's work to do. Keeping your tools and equipment in order, you tidy the fences and clear snow from paths, making sure the village remains accessible when the thaw comes. You notice how the cold changes everything. Metal tools left outside can become brittle, snapping unexpectedly if handled roughly. That's why you take care to store your plows and scythes in sheds, tucked away under thick thatched roofs, preventing frost damage. A simple but essential precaution. Interestingly, some peasants took the extra step of coating iron tools in animal fat or tallow to create a protective layer against rust and freezing. This odd practice sometimes extended to leather boots and gloves too, making them more water-resistant. Historians still debate how commonly tallow was used this way, but it shows the creative mindsets peasants employed to cope with harsh winter conditions. You walk past a pile of firewood stacked meticulously, imagining how many hours it took to cut, split, and carry each log. Firewood was a precious commodity, your lifeblood during these freezing months. A peculiar cold hack you might appreciate. Some peasants used dung cakes, dried animal manure, as an alternative fuel source. It burned slower and produced less heat than wood, but was abundant and free. The smell, less charming. Yet, in a pinch, it kept fires alive. As you work, you notice the stillness of the land. No buzzing insects, no birdsong. just the muffled crunch of snow underfoot. Wildlife retreats or adapts, just like you. Speaking of adaptation, you recall how medieval peasants sometimes used animal fats, not just for cooking or lighting lamps, but as skin protectants. A thin layer could help shield against windburn and frostbite, though whether it was effective or just folklore remains a topic of scholarly debate. The village well, frozen over for weeks, is now partially thawing near the surface. You'll soon be able to draw fresh water again, a welcome relief after weeks of melting snow or relying on stored supplies. Despite the harshness, winter has a rhythm, a slow heartbeat pulsing through the village. Days like these, spent repairing and preparing, feel like a quiet rebellion against the cold. By evening, your body aches. But there's satisfaction in knowing that when spring finally comes, you'll be ready to reclaim the land. For now, you retreat to the warmth of your home, carrying the quiet pride of survival through another day. Night settles again, the wind rattling the thin windows and swirling snow into little drifts outside your cottage. Inside, the fire crackles, casting flickering shadows that dance on the walls. You settle in for one of the more curious medieval winter rituals, the preparation and consumption of warming drinks, meant to fortify both body and spirit against the chill. Hot ale was a staple. Unlike today's crisp brews, medieval ale was often thick, slightly sour and barely filtered, but heated with spices, cinnamon, cloves, ginger. It became a comforting elixir. Sometimes honey or dried fruits were added for sweetness and extra calories. This spiced ale warmed the throat and belly alike, a medieval take on a cozy nightcap. Historians still debate just how widespread spiced ale was among peasants, since spices were expensive, but archaeological evidence of spice residues in pottery suggests it was at least occasionally enjoyed by those who could afford a small luxury. You might find this odd, but peasants also brewed possets, hot milk curdled with ale or wine and flavored with nutmeg or other spices. It was considered medicinal, believed to stave off colds and strengthen the constitution. While it sounds strange now, this drink was a popular winter tonic. Then there's the ever-practical hot herbal tea, infusions made from dried herbs like peppermint, sage, or chamomile served to calm the nerves and aid digestion. You can almost smell the subtle bitterness mixed with the comforting warmth as you sip. A quirky cold hack, some peasants carried small flasks of heated wine or brandy, which they'd sip sparingly to stave off the cold during long outdoor chores. The alcohol provided a quick, though temporary, warmth that tricked the senses into feeling cozy. Of course, overindulgence could be dangerous, but moderation was key. Warming drinks weren't just about physical heat. They were also a social ritual. Families and neighbors might gather around the hearth, sharing these drinks and stories, reinforcing bonds that helped weather not just the cold, but the long, dark winter. You notice how the firelight softens the edges of the room, the warmth from the cup in your hands seeping slowly into your fingers. Outside, the cold is relentless, but here, comfort is crafted with every sip and every shared laugh. And as the night deepens, you feel a little richer, not just in body warmth, but in the richness of community and tradition. Winter, you realize, is as much about connection as survival. You awake to the distant crow of a rooster, the the day breaking with a promise of more cold. The snow outside crunches beneath your boots as you step outside, the sharp air filling your lungs like a brisk tonic. Today's focus: how medieval peasants kept themselves moving, active and warm, despite the temptation to huddle endlessly by the fire. It's easy to imagine that everyone simply stayed inside, but surviving winter meant work, and a fair amount of it. You spend the day chopping wood, hauling water, and tending to chores that simply can't wait. Movement generates heat, and a body in motion is less prone to the aches and chills that so often plagued those who remained sedentary. Here's a fascinating fact. Peasants often timed their heavier labor around the daylight hours because candles and lamps were precious and limited. That meant starting work before sunrise and pushing hard to finish by late afternoon, making every minute count in the short winter days. One quirky habit to combat the cold was the use of warming exercises. This might involve simple stretches, brisk walking, or even jumping jacks, well, medieval style. Historians still debate how formalized such exercises were, but plenty of records mention the importance of physical activity for maintaining health during the winter months. Even games and dances played a part, though less frequent than in summer. Festivals like Twelfth Night sometimes featured communal dancing indoors, raising spirits and body temperatures alike. Imagine a cramped medieval hall filled with energetic peasants stomping and twirling, laughter ringing through the chilly air. You yourself find that a quick round of movement around the hearthroom staves off the chill, waking your muscles and making you feel alive. It's a reminder that survival isn't just about shelter and clothing, but also about keeping the spirit and body engaged. Animals follow similar patterns: cows shifting weight from hoof to hoof, chickens fluffing feathers to trap warmth. You mimic their instincts as best you can, moving to stay warm and stave off the creeping numbness. A curious but little-known tip: peasants sometimes rubbed their hands and feet with a mixture of animal fat and herbs to improve circulation before heading outdoors. It sounds odd, but the oils created a protective barrier against windburn and frostbite. By evening, your muscles ache pleasantly, the fire's heat welcoming, but no longer your sole source of warmth. You settle in with a deeper appreciation for the body's resilience and the surprisingly active role it played in medieval winter survival. The cold is fierce, but your spirit is fiercer. The last stretch of winter winds down, and though the cold still bites, you sense the slow return of light and warmth. The days lengthen, the snow softens into slush, and the earth beneath whispers promises of renewal. This final phase of winter is about preparation, gathering strength for spring's rebirth and ensuring survival one last time before the thaw. Your days are spent inspecting the tools and equipment you stowed away, repairing broken handles and sharpening blades. These small acts of care will pay off when planting season arrives. You clean out animal stalls, replacing old straw with fresh bedding, making the barns ready for new life. The village buzzes with cautious hope. There's talk of melting ice on the river, the first crocuses pushing through the thawing soil. Yet, winter's grip lingers in the morning frost and evening chill. You notice the shift in diet, too. More fresh greens appearing in your meals, like early wild herbs foraged from sheltered spots. These greens offer vitamins long missed, and a welcome change from the heavy stews and preserved foods. You remember the fascinating tradition of spring cleaning, which in medieval times was literally that, a deep cleanse of the home to rid it of winter's grime and stale smells. Fireplaces were scrubbed, rushes on the floors replaced, and walls repainted with whitewash to brighten the dim interiors. It was a symbolic fresh start, as much as a practical one. Quirky, but true. Some peasants believed that letting sunlight flood the home during this time chased away evil spirits and sickness that winter's darkness might have brought. Historians still debate the extent of these superstitions, but agree they reflect a deep connection between people, health, and the rhythms of nature. You prepare for the final cold nights by stacking the last firewood and laying out fresh herbs to dry for the coming months. These herbs are medicine and seasoning, little treasures to keep winter's shadow at bay. The knowledge you carry, accumulated through countless winters, is your most precious resource. Every cold hack, every shared story, every hard-earned lesson intertwines into a fabric of resilience woven tight with hope. As you lie down one last time, with the chill whispering outside, you feel a quiet peace. The long winter will fade, and with it, the hardships. But you will carry its lessons, warmth, and stubborn spirit forward. And when spring finally blooms, you'll be ready. The cold has softened now, the harsh edges of winter blurring into gentle whispers of warmth. You can almost feel the earth breathing beneath the melting snow, a slow, steady exhale after the frozen hold. The heavy weight of frost and darkness lifts, leaving behind a calm, soothing quiet. As you lie here, wrapped in layers of thick wool and worn linen, your body remembers the chill, but craves the gentle embrace of spring's promise. You feel the softness of your bedding, the fading heat of the last embers in the hearth, and the faint scent of dried herbs hanging overhead. The world outside may still be cold, but inside there is comfort. Comfort built from generations of survival, from stories told by firelight, from shared meals and whispered prayers. Every shiver, every breath of cold air, every frostbitten finger was met with resilience and a touch of stubborn hope. You're not just a survivor. You're part of a long chain of humanity that learned to endure, to adapt, to thrive even when the cold seemed endless. And soon, the sun will return fully, thawing the land, waking the rivers, and inviting life back into the world. For now, let the quiet wash over you. Let your mind drift gently on the soft hum of the fading night, on the warmth stored deep within your bones. Sleep, knowing you've made it through another winter. The world waits patiently for your awakening. And so do I. Good night.